this is 5 months to date, and it's probably one of the most difficult 5 months of most of our lives, and it's probably not going to get any easier anytime soon. And that's the truth. We need to actually reflect on that and understand that this is a uphill battle, do you know what I mean? But we're here to pay respects, and we're here to give memory to those who are no longer with us.
We will gather together Grenville residents, the bereaved families, and the community to show that we will not forget what happened on the 14th of June. And we will continue to support each other and seek justice.
Justice! 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 Justice!
Large numbers of people are deeply, deeply angry and resentful of the way in which a tiny minority, elites everywhere, in every country, have disproportionately built up private wealth, leaving the rest of us to struggle with broken social security systems, with all kinds of problems that the state previously used to be attentive to. The replacement of all that with this new liberal fantasy of individual entrepreneurship, thinking of society as a marketplace, all these notions have now proven to be utterly deceptive, and have essentially made many people think that they've been cheated.
Where does the anger come from that seems to be currently controlling our interrelationships? And how is that anger being used by politicians to instigate their own political agendas? Anger in the United Kingdom has led to the dramatic choice for Brexit.
Let June the 23rd go down in our history as our Independence Day.
Through the eyes of Indian writer Pankaj Mishra, we will dissect the mindset of a country in a state of confusion. This is Backlight. Welcome to the latter days of a superpower. On the 14th of June 2017, the residents of a high-rise apartment building in London were confronted with a devastating fire.
Well, it's towering inferno, isn't it?
How is that possible?
It's jumped up all the way along the flats. Look.
Oh my God.
There were 71 fatalities and many others were left wounded.
I was asleep. I was meant to have work the next morning, and one of my family members was knocking on my door, shouting that there was a fire. So in my head, just waking up, I thought there was a fire in my own house. So I woke up in a panic. There was no fire. And where he told me that the tower, the block across the road, was on fire, and I didn't know how serious it. Like I said, I've seen fires in tower blocks before. And then so I came out of my house quickly, and I could just see smoke in the air. And I looked up, and the entire building was completely covered in flames, like completely covered. It felt like war. We felt this place was a war zone.
We're so close. We had the burning debris coming to us, coming to our homes, coming through the windows. It was quite scary for people because you didn't know whether you had to stay or go inside or leave. It was very scary because there were a lot of explosions and it felt like the building was moving. And if the building collapses, it collapses on us. So you can see how close.
It's really next door to you, isn't it?
Yeah, it was really terrifying.
And then you sit and you look into someone's face, and the look of lifeless is the best way to explain it. And I was looking at the firemen, and I think it made me realize, you know what, you've just done and experienced and seen things that no man or woman should ever have to go through.
I saw people jumping. I heard, sorry.
Grenville Tower, I can't think of a more tragic and clear illustration of what happened in this country over the last 3 decades of deregulation, privatization, outsourcing, marketization, where you essentially encourage the principle of utility, profit, efficiency over all other considerations, including human lives.
In his work, Indian writer Pankaj Mishra has delved into the underlying causes behind political unrest, populism and extremism. He divides his time between a small village in India and the mundane life of London. He looks at the United Kingdom through the eyes of an outsider, but also with the sentiment of a former subject of the once ever so mighty British Kingdom. Mishra dissects with the utmost precision what the loss of an empire and many years of neoliberal policies have done for the United Kingdom. Focusing on Brexit, we examine what still remains of the British superpower. An empire that once covered the globe, but is now no more than a dream from the past, cherished by an elite living as if time stood still.
I came in 1995 when I was 26 years old. And, for a long time, if you grow up in a country like India, you have a certain image of England. Obviously, because the country was colonized, the British were there for more than 2 centuries. So you have a very specific image of this country, of imperialists who traveled around the world, who established colonies in remote places like Australia, who exported their civilization to remote parts of the world. And when I came here, what surprised me was how, first of all, Americanized British culture had become, political culture, literary culture, how much of dependence there was in all kinds of ways that in politics, in literature, people were looking to the United States as a kind of model. This has started, of course, in the 1980s with this symbiosis of Reagan and Thatcher, a kind of ideological unity, shared ideas, shared ideologies. The way the British economy had been re-engineered, the stress that had been placed on deregulation, privatization, which of course then traveled around the world. This is something that I had not anticipated at all, and that really surprised me, because I'd really thought of British culture as something singular, self-confident, proud, and to find it so dependent on the United States for ideas, for inspiration, was a bit of a shock. Because I had imagined the British to be much more self-confident, much more reconciled to the loss of their empire. This is a very conservative country in the end. We've had essentially an imperial elite, and it has promised to the masses that you can also be a member of this elite. So it has been very accommodating, it's been very capacious, but it's never really had any incentive to examine its most deeply felt, deeply cherished myths. And those are largely about empire. For more than 150 years, this country was the most powerful in the world. Its military, its trade links, its possessions around the world made it the preeminent nation. And when you look at the size of this country, it was an extraordinary disproportion between what Britain was, a small European country, a small island, and the power and authority it possessed in different parts of the world. Now that has shaped British identity to an extent that we don't really clearly understand, even to this day. And to lose that power, which they started to do in the 1940s, from the 1940s onwards, has been a greater trauma, has been a much, much more complex and traumatic experience than most of us realize.
A banquet marked the end of Lord Louis Mountbatten's term of office as Governor-General of India.
The beginning of the end of the British Empire came with the dramatic demise of Governor-General Lord Mountbatten.
The swearing-in of the new Governor-General, Mr. Rajagopalachari, was a unique occasion. For this, of course, is the first time that an Indian has held the position. It must have been with mixed feelings that Lord Louis left the Durbar House for the start of his long journey home. Both he and Lady Mountbatten were to receive a farewell from the people of India, which displayed in full measure the esteem in which they are held by all classes.
And this has been a great realization over the last 20 years that I've known this country, is that empire as a fantasy has remained dominant in the imagination of many politicians, journalists, commentators, that it is a ghost that cannot be exorcised. It remains. It's a specter. And it has, it's been 50, 60 years since decolonization. That remains the most important influence on British politics and culture today.
And if you look around in London, where can you find this idea or this image of grandeur that they still think exists?
Well, you mostly find it in the political elite, who have come out of elite institutions, who belong to elite networks, and who still live by these notions of Britain being great once upon a time and how it can be made great again. A lot of what happened during the Brexit campaign, for instance, was very directly connected to this fantasy some very powerful, influential people in this country have had about Britain regaining its imperial vigor. If not through affiliation or partnership with the United States, then on its own. They are charming, these rituals of self-affirmation, I have to say.
One remnant from the glorious past is the yearly inauguration of the Lord Mayor of London. A ritual that stems from the 12th century. The Lord Mayor at one time represented the residents of the City of London. Now he is ambassador of mainly the City, the financial capital of international finance. Each year, during the banquet in Guildhall, once the political centre of the city, the political elite and top of the international business community come together.
The Lord Mayor has precedence in the city. This goes back to the arrangements that were agreed 800 years ago with King John. The Lord Mayor goes in front of the Queen with a pearl sword. I had to do that when the Queen came to the St Paul's Cathedral to celebrate her 90th birthday. I was privileged to be the Lord Mayor at that time, and I had the pearl sword like this, and people said, "Is it very heavy?" And you're concentrating so hard it doesn't feel very heavy, I can tell you. But, and you have to lay it down in front of her.
3 cheers for the Lord Mayor and Lady Mayoress. Hip hip! Hooray! Hip hip! Hooray! Hip hip! Hooray!
The Lord Mayor is really the spokesman and ambassador for UK professional and financial business services. You head the corporation, which is a very unusual local authority, but in particular you have this spokesman and ambassador role. And you speak for the city and you speak to the city.
How important is tradition here in this whole
Well, I
system?
think it's a great strength, and therefore it is part of the fabric. But I think, the city is a very innovative, very modern, very fast place, so that it's part of everything. But I think It certainly doesn't hold us back. It's something we value. But, for example, for the Lord Mayor, the traditional things the Lord Mayor does, it's maybe 5% of the time.
The Lord Mayor is a purely ceremonial post. It is really meant to essentially keep alive a tradition of ceremonies that England excels in. So you have a man dressed in that costume, a couple of white wigged figures around him, all denoting a long past, a long tradition that never dies in this country. That is the function of the Lord Mayor, to represent continuity. He has no responsibilities whatsoever. He has no powers whatsoever, really. I mean, apart from ceremonial responsibilities. Britain has always excelled in pomp and circumstance, big ceremonies, Scottish bagpipes. I saw some of them in India growing up. Wherever they went, the British, they exported these rituals and these ceremonies. And in many parts of the world, you still see them. A way of dressing, a way of conducting a particular ceremony and ritual. This is part of the elitism I was speaking about. It's a way of being in the world that consists of all kinds of attitudes, all kinds of rituals, all kinds of ceremonies, from cricket to Lord Mayor's ceremony, to a certain way of cutting your coat, of wearing tweed. All of this is part of this package of elitism. We are at the heart of London here. Buckingham Palace is behind me. And again, I think so much of British identity has been consolidated through a certain kind of urban architecture, especially statues of this kind, particularly the one in front of me. This is a man called Lawrence of Punjab, who was one of the British officials in North India. When the mutiny erupted, these were Indian soldiers who basically rebelled against their British officers, and then the rebellion spread across North India. And this figure was one of the people leading the suppression of the mutiny. So he was guilty of what we would call today incredible range of war crimes. So it's always a strange shock to walk in these parts and see a statue of this man who I grew up in India thinking of as essentially a cruel imperialist. Indians have built their identity on anti-imperialism. I grew up in India learning that the British were great villains, that they destroyed India. Likewise, people in China. Their idea of Britain is very different from the fantasy people have about themselves here. So there's a big gap between what people think about themselves in Britain and how Britain is perceived in large parts of the world.
Boris Johnson is being chaperoned by the British ambassador.
This is the biggest bell.
During a state visit to Myanmar, one of the former British colonies, Minister of Foreign Affairs Boris Johnson could not resist mentioning the glorious days of the colonial past.
Bells, they say. We've got one bell. Come you back, you English soldier. Remember that too.
The fragments are from the pro-colonial classic poem about Burma called Mandalay by Rudyard Kipling. The ambassador is quick to spot that reminding their hosts of British rule might not be wise.
So probably not. What, the Rage Mandalay? No, not appropriate.
As the US Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, put it famously, that Britain has lost an empire, but it hasn't found a role for itself. And that remains, he said that in the 1950s, that remains tragically true even to this day. The challenge always was, what do you do when you lose an empire like that? And really rediscover geography. Hence the comedy of Theresa May going to India and being utterly rebuffed. This has happened, by the way, to other prime ministers as well, who still think they can draw upon the store of goodwill that they created while they were in India. She went to India soon after the Brexit vote, realized this notion of what was called here Empire 2.0, that we can again become great again by bringing our Commonwealth brothers and sisters together. She realized that the world had moved on, that it draw upon the store of goodwill that they created while they were in India, and that the world outside had very different images of Britain. And sentimentality in this country has been really shaping politics to an unprecedented degree. To a degree seen nowhere, I dare to say, in the world today.
And that's dangerous in a
It's
way.
absolutely dangerous. We've seen it already. We've seen, I think, Brexit. People like myself have been saying how dangerous this is. This view of empire, this fantasy, these inflated notions of one's importance, self-importance, that these are not just harmless conceits, that they can have a fatal consequence. And we saw then last year in the form of Brexit, that a country essentially was forced down a very perilous path, which could really have disastrous effects on this country's politics, on this country's economy, and indeed the future of many people living in this country today. The problem begins when you lose that power, when the people you have trampled upon become more assertive. They have their own ideas about who you are. They have their own plans. And your fantasy about yourself starts to collide with their notion of who you are. That is the problem in which we find ourselves today. It is a sign of arrogance. It is a sign of provincialism. And this is what happens with power. Power makes you provincial. It really narrows your mind. You feel you don't need to enter the worldview of your victims, the worldviews of the weak, the worldviews of the powerless, because you can do things with your power and you don't have to listen to what other people are saying. That habit can be sustained over a long period, and it was sustained during the long decades of imperialism. There was no need to listen to these dark victims of imperialism. We could do whatever the hell we wanted.
The residents of Grenville Tower are still searching for answers some 5 months after the fire. Zayad Kred was living across from the apartment building when the fire broke out. He was one of the first to come to the aid of the victims.
Grenville Tower, we know, could have been avoided. The building was neglected for years before the tragedy. So before June 14th, residents were complaining about safety within the tower, fire safety, the fact that the building work has taken place, that there is one staircase to exit the building in case of emergency. A quote was put out there in, I think it was 2012 or 2014, saying that we fear that it will take a tragedy to happen before our concerns are listened to.
As one of the last bastions of social housing, Grenville Tower stood in the middle of a neighbourhood for millionaires.
So the Grenville Tower is essentially social housing. And now it has become very distinctive because it happens to be in one of the richest boroughs in Western Europe, Kensington and Chelsea, which is a place that many rich people from elsewhere, from abroad, Russian plutocrats, Arabs, Chinese, Indians, they have properties in that borough. And for that reason, real estate prices there have gone through the roof, making it the most expensive in Britain.
In this area, in the last 20 years, we've been ignored, set aside, and every time we raised concern, nobody really listened. And when it comes to think about it, we're talking about families, we're talking about people being scared, not feeling safe in their home, and nothing was done about it.
Even before the fire?
Even before, people raised, and it's almost as if we don't have a voice, or the local authority decide what's right for us.
These people who are making the decisions have never lived like us. They've never even stepped foot into social housing. They haven't smelt urine in the staircase or seeing crackheads in your staircase taking drugs. They've never experienced that. So how can you really make decisions to benefit us if you've never lived like us? That is the biggest problem we have.
But then Theresa May did come to your area to talk with you.
So Theresa May, if we talk about Theresa May, she came to the area 3 or 4 days after the tragedy. When she did come 2 days after the tragedy, she didn't spend a single minute with anyone from the community. She came to see the firemen at the bottom of the tower and left within 20 minutes or so. It's a publicity stunt. It's oh, I'm the Prime Minister, I must come here and be seen to do something. If you really care about this community and the people here, you should have made an effort from day one.
Out the way.
Almost 6 weeks after the fire, and still only 20 families have been housed.
People are still sleeping on the floor in the Westway Centre. So when we talk about a public inquiry, there should also be an inquiry as to how a council can absolutely abdicate its responsibility towards its local citizens.
I'm here today because I stood and watched the building burn down. We were prevented from going into the building to save innocent children. If a society cannot care for the vulnerable, what type of society is that?
The failings of our government and our local council, that made me realise how much of a failing the Grenville Tower fire was and how serious it was. Because for an establishment and for an organisation to go into hiding after a tragedy like that, all that says to me is you are covering something that you have done wrong here.
So you have a borough where rich people have vacation homes, and then you have the social housing where some of the poorest people, many of them immigrants, live. This, in the larger scheme of things, looking at it from an authority's point of view, this is an eyesore. This is not something they want. Really, ideally, if they could do away with it, they would. They can't do it. Social housing, it'll be bad for PR and everything. So there it is, systematically neglected over the years, while properties for the rich, infrastructure for the rich goes up alongside it.
And just before Grenville, this local authority was looking at perhaps knocking down our building to rebuild different type of properties, and it's more advantageous for them to sell the properties or to get private landlords. So it feels like they just want us to get out of the area, so they are in a position to increase rents and get more value out of these lands.
This disconnect between people who are victims of this tragedy and the people who are supposed to be their representative is also part of a larger dysfunctional political system, where the representatives have in a way seceded from those they represent. They are in their own world, where they network with other people like themselves, other representatives, with representatives of business, of finance, and they come around whenever there are elections and persuade people to vote for them. But they do not represent those people in any meaningful way. Their role is to either make sure that society is working like a marketplace and that the market is producing the best outcomes. Their role is to advance marketization. This is, again, connecting to what I was saying earlier about the role of the government has been reduced to essentially advancing the interests of business. When you have that role in mind, there is going to be an obvious systemic disconnect between what you do and what those you represent, the people, want and need.
What are you doing here? I thought you resigned.
I told you I resigned as council leader.
You resigned as council leader? So why are you here?
Because I'm still a councillor. I'm still an elected councillor.
Wow. So what are you talking about? Are you talking about Grenville?
Talking about a lot of things this evening.
Is Grenville part of what you're talking about?
I'm going to a meeting with colleagues. When
I know. Are you talking about Grenville? I'm a Grenville survivor. I need to know if you're talking about us.
I'm sure that will be on the agenda.
So basically, so you're still working and you're still doing stuff about Grenville?
Very upset about it indeed.
You're not upset because you haven't showed no emotions. You haven't showed nothing. No, you're not.
It has become an entrenched political culture. So we are, in a way, looking at a crisis of democracy. The democracy is ceasing to work for many people here. People feeling that they're not represented, and that this system of elections, of parliaments, has its own logic and its own dynamic, which excludes ordinary people.
Okay.
The distance between the public and the political caste meant to represent them has resulted in unrestrained rage towards the elite, the cosmopolitan elite as Mishra describes them, who are to blame for everything, and who, according to Mishra, have for decades chanted the mantra of the free marketplace. The masses are now turning on the elite as they feel they are victims to deregulation and globalization, and because they no longer feel represented by the controlling power brokers, a sentiment picked up all too eagerly by the Brexit campaign.
What was extraordinary about the Brexit campaign is that the country's traditional elite, which is the Conservative Party, the party of landowners, of industrialists, they, at least some people, not the entire party, managed to convince people here, at least a significant part of the electorate here, that the real villains are these technocrats in Brussels. Those are the cosmopolitan elites that are undermining this country, and indeed their agents here in the city, at the Financial Times, in the Economist. So these sort of elites became the villains in this particular narrative.
We are also being undermined by a rather shadowy bunch of people. Hedge fund managers, elitist lawyers, secretive businessmen, who are going off to the courts to try and find loopholes, to try and prevent the voice of the British people from being heard, and we're not going to let them succeed either.
What we see now is a kind of split where one part of the elite, which was very much part of, let's not forget, this is the same Conservative Party that floated the idea of deregulation, privatization. What does it have to say to people who are angry and frustrated right now? This is what they're trying to say. Your troubles are due to immigration, because of foreigners, because of the European Union, because of Brussels, because of technocrats. Trust in us. We're going to restore Britain to its great imperial power that it once enjoyed. And you need to start distrusting these citizens of nowhere, these rootless cosmopolitans, these technocrats who have been enriching themselves all this time. That is the rhetoric.
You look at some of these fat cats who go into Danzig, lobby the government, tell the government that they're going to support Remain, What do they know? What do they know of the impact of immigration on school places and hospital waiting lists and GP surgeries? They know nothing about it. They know absolutely nothing about it.
So we have to understand this as a particular rhetorical political maneuver. You offer a new narrative, or sometimes a refurbished narrative of imperial power, of imperial glory, on emphasizing certain aspects which were not so important in the past.
Let's fight against the great complacent, glutinous armies of the establishment. We can win. We can win on June the 23rd.
So it's actually the same people who were gaining from it in the beginning are now against it.
Absolutely.
And putting up this rhetoric.
Absolutely.
More or less.
Absolutely. So this is where I think one has to be very suspicious of accepting that rhetoric at face value. People who are claiming to be nativists today, or people who are claiming to be more English than everyone else, these are people already embedded in various global networks, beneficiaries of those.
And they are the elites.
They are the elites themselves, yes. One has to understand these contradictions, not in sort of some kind of either-or way, but as an attempt by an elite that feels itself threatened to come up with a new ideology, come up with something that can persuade large numbers of people in this country to keep them in power. And that is why I think, they will resort to this imperial fantasy. They will get in bed with cosmopolitan elites if they need to, while at the same time denouncing them in public. But it is essentially a scramble for power. This is something we have to understand. When I was growing up in India, to be modern was to renounce the past. It was to renounce hierarchy. It was to believe that the hierarchies of the past, whether of caste or class, was something to be done away with. It was to be truly equal, or to aspire towards an egalitarian society.
115, please. Thank you.
When you're on the top of your social hierarchy, you're never really aware of how it feels to be at the bottom. So I think it's actually really important for Indians to expose themselves to situations where they are the ones at the bottom. You come to understand how most people around the world feel, and how they look at the world, how disadvantaged they are in so many different ways. But if you put a lot of protective layers around yourself, of class, of nationality, and you start to define yourself within, well enclosed by those layers, then you'll end up with a kind of hidebound attitude that we see in this country increasingly, especially in the run-up to Brexit. A lot of things went into the making of Brexit. And one of the most important things, which I think people outside of Britain don't really understand, you have to live here in this country and be exposed to poison spewed by these tabloids day in and day out. You can open practically a tabloid like the Daily Mail or the Sun any day, and you will find some instance of Islamophobia, anti-immigrant sentiment, all kinds of crude, vulgar sensationalism, mostly about foreigners, how dodgy they are, how unreliable, how we need to do our own thing. Look at this, for instance. Just to give you a sample, if you buy the newspaper tomorrow, you'll see an image like this again, and the day after, and the following days, every edition. So if you're exposed to this poison day in and day out, in the best of circumstances, you'll come to believe that Britain is a country besieged by dark-skinned foreigners, immigrants, Muslims, that we are being cheated, we are being deceived, these people are taking over our country. All the sentiments that went into Brexit.
No more! No more oppression by Islam! No.
afraid of Brexit?
Yeah, look, you know what makes me more afraid of Brexit is the deeper meanings behind the votes. Is, like I said, this is when it goes back to we can talk a talk, you can talk the talk, but can you walk the walk? Now, in the lead up to Brexit, a lot of it was about, immigration, and we must keep our country, we must keep English, England, English, and, this, that, or we give the EU 350 million, which we can be giving to our NHS. Look what's happened. A lot of people have voted based on that, based on naive mindsets of knowing who, the term racism lives here. Do you know what I mean? We're not in a day and age where racism doesn't exist here. I've been racially abused in this country. Do you know what I mean? Hundreds of people I know have been in the same situation. And what scares me more about Brexit is the reasons behind people's votes.
And it took a long time. It took many struggles. It took a lot of campaigning, many demonstrations. There were a lot of race riots in this country before the realization sunk in that racism is an ugly prejudice that we need to eradicate. For racism to become mainstream again, to be legitimated in a political campaign, that was an extraordinary setback to political culture in this country. And of course, I think it damaged the social fabric of this country to a degree where you wonder, how long will it take to repair it? Whether it will be ever repaired.
Brexit is a fact of life. There's no way back anymore. How do you see the future of Britain? What will come out of this?
Well, it's very difficult to have a very optimistic view of Britain's future right now, as we speak, because the possibility that negotiations over Brexit might collapse tomorrow is very real today. So it's very difficult to think ahead and imagine a future where this crazy, mad rush to make Britain independent, autonomous, self-sufficient will be checked by some kind of political shock, some kind of political movement which says, enough with this, enough with this. We need to have some rationality in our policy, in our worldview. Right now it's very difficult to see how that can happen. But it's looking very bleak. We are looking at a long unfolding disaster in which this country's economy, its political life, its cultural life, all come under tremendous strain. And who knows, I mean, we can't even visualize the end point of this race towards catastrophe, what the real calamity might look like. But it is a very, very dangerous path that this country is embarked on right now.
And can it still be changed?
I think it can
is
be.
there still a way back? You know?
I think if we have some honest politics in this country, if you have an honest campaign which really educates people about the perils, about the dangers of going down this path that this country is going down on, there is a possibility of change. In fact, that is the only possibility of change right now.
I want to show that we will not forget what happened on the 14th of June. And we will continue to support each other and seek justice.
We know this is not going to be a swift road, but united we stand, divided we fall. We are a collective and we are here.
Justice!
God bless you all. Justice!
Justice!
Justice! Justice! Justice! Justice! Justice!
Thank you for watching. For more on this subject, take a look at the playlist. You can also watch this recommended video. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and we'll keep you updated on our documentaries.